There is a particular kind of grief that comes with losing someone who made childhood feel magical. Not a parent, not a teacher, but a voice, a face. A character you met at exactly the right age, in exactly the right moment, one that somehow got inside you and stayed there, long after the credits rolled. For millions of people who grew up in the early 2000s, that character was Lilo. A funny, heartbroken, fiercely weird little girl from Hawaii who adopted an alien she thought was a dog and taught him, slowly, what it meant to belong somewhere. A character who said, in words simple enough for a child to understand and deep enough to carry into adulthood, Ohana means family. Family means nobody gets left behind or forgotten. On June 16, 2026, the woman who gave Lilo her voice passed away. She was 35 years old. Her name was Daveigh Chase. And for a brief, brilliant window in the early 2000s, she did something almost no one has ever done. She voiced the lead character in two of the most beloved animated films of a generation, and in the same year, terrified an entire generation in one of the most iconic horror films ever made. This is her story, and it deserves to be told fully and carefully and with the respect she was owed throughout a life that was far harder than most of her fans ever knew. Daveigh Elizabeth Chase was born on July 24, 1990 in Las Vegas, Nevada, and raised in Albany, Oregon, a small, quiet Pacific Northwest town a long way from the entertainment industry in every sense. She began performing almost before she was old enough to remember beginning. Singing and dancing at community events, commercials at age 7, a starring role in the local musical Utah at 8. The story of how she actually broke into film is one of those stranger-than-fiction Hollywood accidents that sounds too convenient to be real, except it is. When Daveigh was around 8 years old, her family was in Los Angeles on a road trip when a car crash temporarily stranded them in the city. Her mother, unable to simply sit and wait, found a local talent agency and walked her daughter in. That single impulsive detour during an interrupted trip led directly to a commercial booking, and then another, and then another, and then everything that followed. She began appearing on television almost immediately. Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Charmed, ER, The Practice, small roles, building credits, developing the instincts of a professional performer in front of actual cameras, while most kids her age were still figuring out middle school. By the time she was 11, she had been handpicked by Steven Spielberg himself to sing God Bless America in his film AI Artificial Intelligence. As a child, she had also performed as an opening act for Reba McEntire with a small band, a detail that tells you something important. This was not just a child pushed in front of cameras by ambitious parents. This was a kid with genuine, multi-directional talent who had been performing since before she could fully articulate why she loved it. And then came the year 2001, and then the year 2002, and in the space of roughly 12 months, everything changed. What Daveigh Chase accomplished between October 2001 and October 2002 is genuinely extraordinary, and it's the kind of thing that only becomes clear when you actually line it up side by side. It started with Donnie Darko in 2001, Richard Kelly's strange, deeply unsettling cult film starring Jake Gyllenhaal. Chase played Samantha Darko, Donnie's younger sister. A small role, but a significant one. She was the little girl leading the Sparkle Motion dance troupe in the film's most ironically cheerful sequence, perfectly capturing a kind of childhood innocence set against something deeply wrong in the world around it. The film would go on to become one of the most discussed cult films of its era. It was the beginning. Then came Spirited Away. Studio Ghibli's masterpiece, Hayao Miyazaki's Oscar-winning animated epic about a 10-year-old girl named Chihiro who stumbles into a magical spirit world and has to find her courage to survive it. Chase voiced Chihiro for the English-language dub. The film won the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature in 2003. It remains to this day one of the highest-rated animated films ever made, and at its center, in the English version, was the voice of a girl from Albany, Oregon, who was barely a teenager herself. And then, in the same extraordinary stretch of time, 2 more films arrived almost simultaneously. Lilo and Stitch, Disney's 2002 animated film about a lonely, eccentric little Hawaiian girl who adopts what she thinks is a dog and names him Stitch. Chase voiced Lilo, and not in a generic, bright and cheerful Disney heroine way. Lilo was specific. Lilo was odd. Lilo was a child who had already lost her parents, who struggled to make friends, who carried grief in the middle of comedy and warmth. Chase brought all of that to the character with a naturalism that was rare in any actor, let alone a child voice performer. She won an Annie Award for the performance. She reprised the role in the subsequent TV series and multiple direct-to-video sequels. For years, that character's voice was hers. And The Ring. Gore Verbinski's 2002 horror remake of the Japanese film Ringu, starring Naomi Watts as a journalist investigating a cursed videotape. Chase played Samara Morgan, the pale long-haired girl who crawled out of a television well and became one of the defining horror images of the decade. She won the MTV Movie Award for Best Villain in 2003 for the role. And for an entire generation of kids who were slightly too young to be watching The Ring but watched it anyway at slumber parties, her face became the image that appeared in nightmares for years afterward. Same year, same girl. The voice of Disney's most beloved new heroine and the face of one of Hollywood's most terrifying villains. She was 12 years old. After that extraordinary peak, Chase kept working steadily throughout her teens and into her 20s. She played a recurring role in the long-running TV series Big Love from 2006 to 2011, appearing in 47 episodes as Rhonda Vollmer, a teenage girl caught up in the complex world of a polygamous Utah family. It was a very different kind of role from anything she'd done before, and she handled it with the same quiet naturalism that had characterized her best earlier work. She appeared in additional films. She recorded original songs. She remained, throughout her teens and early 20s, a working professional in an industry that is notoriously difficult for child stars to navigate as they age out of the specific kind of roles that made them famous. And then, quietly, the credits slowed. The projects became less frequent, and what was happening in her life behind the public record became something that almost nobody outside her immediate circle knew about, until, in her final weeks, the contours of it started to become visible. The entertainment industry has a specific, well-documented way of building children up into public figures, and then, when they stop being useful as the specific type of child they were, releasing them into adulthood with very little preparation for what that actually means. Daveigh Chase navigated all of that largely out of the public eye. What her father, John Schwalier, and others who knew her have confirmed is that her final years were defined by real, serious hardship. Housing instability. The kind of physical fragility that comes with malnutrition and a body that hasn't been adequately taken care of. A difficult, painful estrangement from her family that left her largely alone in a city that is not kind to people who have fallen out of the particular orbit that once made them visible. She died on June 16, 2026 of complications from meningitis and sepsis, a blood infection that led to septic shock and organ failure. She was in the hospital when she passed. She was 35 years old. She had been born in Las Vegas in the summer of 1990. She had voiced the lead character of an Academy Award-winning film before she was a teenager. She had terrified a generation with a single image. She had spent years giving Lilo's voice to every sequel and television episode and video game appearance, keeping that character alive for children who were born long after the original film came out. And in her final weeks, she was battling illness alone in Los Angeles, far from most of the people who had known her during the years when her name meant something to the world. That gap between what her public legacy was and what her private circumstances had become is the hardest part of this story to sit with. Not because it's unusual in Hollywood, but precisely because it isn't. The timing of Daveigh Chase's death carries a particular cruelty that isn't lost on anyone paying attention. In 2025 and 2026, a live-action remake of Lilo and Stitch was in production. The character she had voiced for years was once again in the cultural conversation. New generations were discovering the original film. Older fans were revisiting it with their own children. The Ohana means family quote was everywhere again. And Daveigh Chase, the woman whose voice is inseparable from that character, who gave Lilo her specific, irreplaceable sound, was not there to see it. She had already faded from the industry, from the press releases, from the conversations. By the time the movie that made her famous was having its biggest cultural moment in 20 years, she was dying in a hospital in Los Angeles. There is something worth saying here plainly. The entertainment industry has enormous resources. The characters Daveigh Chase brought to life, Lilo, Chihiro, Samara, have generated hundreds of millions of dollars. The franchises she contributed to remain active and profitable. And the human being whose voice and face made those things possible died at 35, in difficult circumstances, without the kind of support or stability that her contributions should arguably have ensured. That is not a comfortable thing to say. It is, however, a true one. Here is what I want you to take away from Daveigh Chase's story. Not just the roles, not just the remarkable, almost impossible achievement of that 12-month window in 2001 and 2002, when a girl from Albany, Oregon, voiced the leads of two animated masterpieces and terrified an entire generation in a horror film, all simultaneously. The whole story. A child who started performing at community events and ended up in front of Spielberg's camera before she could drive. A girl who gave an alien made of scraps and genetic experiments his first real family through the warmth of her voice. A teenager who disappeared so completely into a horror role that millions of people still can't watch The Ring without thinking of her. A young woman who quietly faded from an industry that had asked everything of her at its most demanding, and then, eventually, needed her to move on so it could do the same with someone new. She died on June 16, 2026. She was 35 years old. She was, and always will be, the voice of Lilo. A little girl who believed that nobody should be left behind or forgotten. If Daveigh Chase's work meant something to you, whether it was Lilo, Samara, Chihiro, or Rhonda, share your memory of her in the comments. Take care of each other. I'll see you in the next one.